has just called in on the phone only. Trying to see who that is. I see everyone else that has connected with a computer connection, but we do have one call-in user that I'm trying to identify here.
Let's do it this way. Can you say Councilman Black?
Oh, now we gotta. So those are the two questions there. Oh, well, that might help. I muted the control room. Hello, everyone. I'm just trying to find out who. We have two different call-in users that I'm trying to identify here. Are either of them the councilman?
No, this is Mark Jordan with North Las Vegas. I'm not, but I'm just calling and listening.
All right.
You have Betsy Fretwell. I'm having a little trouble. Did you start the WebEx by chance? Because it's not coming up on the computer.
Yes, it has been started. Who is that?
All right, I'll go out and try and go back in. Sorry. This
That was
is Betsy
Nancy.
Fretwell.
Okay.
I'm one of the presenters today.
Do we have Councilman Black, Stewart, or Churchill in the WebEx?
Stewart's here.
Councilman Black's here as well.
Hey, Scott.
Hey, Dan, how you doing?
For the two call-in users, if you're having issues connecting as a panelist, the invite email should have a link for connecting as an attendee. You will have to register to connect that way, but I'll be able to identify you better if you can join that way.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. This is Peter Guzman. I couldn't hear anybody else. Just want to make sure I'm okay.
All right, yeah, just about everyone's muted at the moment, so we don't get too
Okay,
much
no problem. So I don't have to do
noise.
anything else with the sound.
Yeah. Matt, if you're in the booth, can you give me a thumbs up? Awesome. Are you ready to start? Okay.
All right, we will go ahead and get started with the meeting for the Southern Nevada Regional Planning Coalition. Due to the Governor's Declaration of Emergency Directive 006, Clark County will not provide a physical location for the public to attend the meeting, but there will be opportunities to participate by written comment and potentially by WebEx platform today. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order, and if we could go forward with the roll call.
Commissioner Jones,
Here.
Councilman Knudsen,
Here.
Councilman Black,
Here.
Councilwoman Bridges, here. Trustee Brooks, Councilman Churchill, Councilwoman Seaman, present. Commissioner Seegerbloom,
Here.
Councilman Shaw,
Here.
Councilman Stewart.
Here.
We do have a quorum. The meeting has been duly posted and is in compliance with the Nevada Open Meeting Law.
Thank you. This is a time for public comment. Do we have any written public comment that's been submitted?
We do not.
Great. Okay. Then we'll move to agenda item number 4, approval of the agenda for the May 7th, 2020 meeting of the SNRPC. Is there a motion?
Move to approve.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, then the agenda is approved for the meeting. Moving to agenda item number 5, approval of the minutes from the February 25th, 2020 SNRPC meeting. Is there any discussion of the minutes from the February meeting? Seeing none, is there a motion?
I would move to approve.
Thank you. The motion is for approval of the minutes of the February 25th, 2020 SNRPC meeting. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. All right, at this time we'll receive a presentation from the Nevada Business Information Network and other Nevada Chambers of Commerce representatives regarding the regional response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I believe that Ms. Fretwell will lead off, and she will turn it over to other presenters for this presentation. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Fretwell?
Hi, Commissioner. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, great. Sorry, it showed that there was control issues at the top of the screen, so thank you. First, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation to present today. Over the last couple of months, we've put together a very robust group of individuals and efforts to try and help create clear lines of communication between all of the basically Nevada business associations across the state, trade associations, chambers of commerce, and economic development agencies. And I believe, I'm not sure if you all are seeing the PowerPoint that we prepared for you today, but today we're planning on having several individuals a part of the presentation today, including Peter Guzman from the Latin Chamber of Commerce, Mary Beth Sewald from the Vegas Chamber, Scott Milrath from Henderson Chamber of Commerce, and Jonas Peterson from the Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance. And we want to talk through some of the key things that we have been participating in and working on. Next slide. So if you look at this, at what we've been focusing in on, Michael Brown over the, in early to mid-March gave us a call and said, listen, we really need some help making sure that we are getting information into and from the business community statewide. Betsy, please don't forget the rurals. And so we have been pulling together a series of conference calls and working sessions since that time to develop a very robust network to achieve that. And it's been very unique because I've been in Nevada for nearly 30 years, not as long as some of you who are sitting on this dais, but for quite a while. And this is probably one of the most collaborative efforts that I've seen across the state to create a business network that's useful both for both ways of communication, but also for policy development. Next slide. So as you can see on this next slide, we basically have laid out a business communication network. The LVGEA has done an incredible job of setting up a hosting website. For example, we've been working with GoEd on coordinating and aggregating business impact data, which we'll talk more about. But we've been providing kind of a full circle, one-stop shop, streamlined way for businesses to be aware of what's going on, provide feedback related to the policies and governmental activities at all levels of government across the state, as well as federal. We're also working with the nonprofit organizations. We've been working with Julie Murray as our primary point of contact for the NGO groups, but to keep an eye on the food supply issues, the status of NGOs, so that we know that as we're building out these discussions that we haven't forgotten that very vital sector of our economy. We've also created an exchange, and we've been developing basically a clearinghouse communication model for us to be able to have these conversations. And I'm really excited to be joined by some of the key folks who have been participating in this from a Southern Nevada perspective, but I did want to just shout out for a moment, and probably is a good intro for Peter, that we have had statewide participation in all of this. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that we've been focusing in on as we work through that is that we made sure that we organized a business emergency operations committee that had individuals from north, south, and rural. And I just give a quick shout out to Amber Stedham from the Henderson Chamber of Commerce for all of her efforts to help coordinate bringing in rural feedback. So we have put together these different teams that are working on this. Some of them are more activated than others, but still stand ready to go. And I think you'll see as Peter walks through his presentation, Mary Beth shares what we've been doing from the Business Emergency Operations Committee, and Scott shares what we're doing from a Business Information Network standpoint, that quite a bit of work has been done. And then I think it's a great wrap up for us to talk about where we go from here and what you all may be able to use our group for moving forward as we work towards reopening Nevada. And frankly, getting ready for what that looks like going forward. So Peter's going to go over the collaboration model and some of the early successes. So I'd like to turn it over to Peter.
Well, thank you, Betsy. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Go ahead.
Thank you. So before I start on my slide, hopefully you're looking at a slide that says rally to the cause. I want to first say thank you to Betsy for rallying the troops. I mean, you guys have no idea how hard Betsy has worked, and just effortlessly and tirelessly, and I'm grateful for that. And that's exactly what it is. It's a rally to the cause. When I tell you that that when this vicious virus hit us, we didn't mope around. We organized. We got together, and when I talk about the collaboration, someday it's going to be spoken about on what an incredible moment this was, where the North, the South, you see all these groups came together for one cause, us being in there together, one. And it's just incredible. And the spirit of collaboration between the North, South, all the chambers, different organizations, nonprofits, council of chambers, it's just been incredible. And I think for that, the community's better off and in a better place because of all of us coming together. And that's kind of who we are, right? That's who Nevada is. That's who our community is. And I'm just grateful that all of these groups should absolutely be recognized for coming together, working together, and trying to get our community back open as quickly as possible in a safe way. But just coming together with resources and information and grants and all kinds of things that are so important. And we'll switch over to the next slide where we're going to do an appreciation spotlight, because I tell you, when we talk about that collaboration, when we talk about that North-South collaboration, how can you do that and not talk about Ann Silver and Mike Kazmierski? When you talk about curbside commerce, curbside retail, these are things that Ann Silver was so passionate about, and you started hearing those terms so much to where even the governor gave a shout out to that term. And when you talk about COVID kindness, you're talking about real dollars going into our community, and at the same time recognizing our first responders. I mean, I just don't know how it gets any better than that. COVID kindness, curbside retail. Mike and Ann, you guys deserve all the appreciation in the world. I'm certainly honored to have been a small part of this and continue to be. Wherever you need me, I will be there, and our chambers will be there, and all these organizations. So with that, I have the privilege and honor to introduce my next colleague who is in the thick of these things, and that's Mary Beth from Vegas Chamber.
Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate your kind words. And I would also echo your thank you to Betsy, who has done yeoman's work here. And I would also echo your enthusiasm for the collaboration, because it has absolutely been unprecedented, and it has been the reason for a lot of our success. So having said that, in my remarks, I'll be talking about policy and recovery. And Betsy mentioned the Business Emergency Operations Committee. She and I were talking about that and discussing it, I think, even as the governor's COVID-19 Nevada Task Force was being formed. So it goes back what now seems like eons ago, but it really is part of the governor's emergency response and recovery plan as laid out in his COVID-19 task force. Betsy, of course, is the chair of the Business Emergency Operations Committee, and consists of leaders and representatives from chambers of commerce, economic development authorities, philanthropy conveyors, and state agencies as well. This group meets 2 to 3 times per week, and truly the committee is designed to connect the business community, policymakers, elected officials, and then the purpose, of course, is to serve as a central hub of information gathering, identifying emerging policy issues, and then we've been adopting some best practices throughout the state in regard to economic recovery. So it also provides information to GOED and the governor's COVID-19 task force on sometimes certainly a daily and sometimes hourly basis. This includes also with the BEOC, as we call it, leveraging relationships has been very important, and resources to help move policy priorities forward, of course, at not only the federal level, but local and state as well. And then we've also been coordinating business issues from the state's trade associations, and that group meets virtually, of course, every Friday. And so we've been providing assistance to the development of the reopening plans as well. State Business Policy Task Force, next on the list. That task force consists of in-house government affairs teams at both the Vegas Chamber and also the Henderson Chamber as well, along with support from their respective lobbying teams, which include the Porter Group, Black and Labello, and then also Carrera, Nevada. This task force has been critical. It supports the BEOC by focusing on those policy and lobbying efforts that are related to COVID-19, like economic recovery and emerging legislation at the state and federal levels as well. So it's also focused on centralizing information and data collection, and then sharing that information with the BEOC and, of course, all of our other partners. And then last, as we talk about getting to phase 1, the BEOC is the informational and policy conduit for the Local Empowerment Advisory Panel, or LEAP. Per the governor's Nevada United Roadmap to Recovery Plan, this approach is federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. So the governor's plan created the LEAP, which is chaired by Clark County Commissioner, as you know, probably Marilyn Kirkpatrick, and then Eureka County Commissioner J.J. Goycochea. So the BEOC is working on supporting the efforts of the LEAP by providing staff resources, also technical expertise, a lot of best practices, and then reopening plans for that we've also collected from other states and counties, along with feedback from the Nevada business community, which also includes the chambers of commerce, I should say, and the state trade associations across the entire state. So we'll continue to work with LEAP, and as we move forward through phase 1, which we are entering into as of Saturday, and we will be very happy to work toward other phases and milestones as directed by the governor's recovery plan. So that concludes my remarks, and with that, I am happy to hand it off now to Scott Mulrath, who is the CEO of the Henderson Chamber of Commerce. Scott?
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mary Beth, and good afternoon to the commission. I'm going to just take a few moments to further outline some of what Mary Beth touched on in regards to the Business Information Network. An effort like this has never been undertaken in the great state of Nevada before. And as Peter emphasized as well, this is built on collaboration. It's truly a network serving as informational conduit to what turned out to be a very vast audience. We relied on about a dozen formal distribution points, which were some of the chambers of commerce, the Latin, Henderson, Vegas chambers, together with the LVGEA, EDON, and the Moonridge Group, amongst a few others. In turn, these hubs distributed information out to a vast network of other organizations and businesses and companies that were really located throughout the state. The diversity of participating organizations was key, as this allowed BIN to connect our state's varied, diversified demographics. Again, that could be based on region, jurisdiction, mission, ethnicities, and other demographics. And this extended to the most rural parts of the state as well. And especially we thank our rural chambers of commerce for being points of dissemination for this information. At times it was very structured. If there was content and topic that was relevant for the entire state, such as featuring the SBA and the PPP program on the LVGEA site is where those were hosted. And sometimes it was very organic when we would have speakers and presenters on COVID-19 topics that would be really specific to a certain member's demographic. And sometimes it was a mix of both. And our respective associations shared events and interviews across their respective portfolios. In the last 45 days, just to kind of quantify and qualify some of what was achieved, at the Latin Chamber, for example, Peter and his team hosted nearly 20 webinars and his Straight Talk interview program. The Reno Sparks Chamber, on their subject matter expert series, had approximately 18 webinars and very impressively averaged 700 attendees as a hub of information in Northern Nevada. Our friends at the Vegas Chamber had nearly 30 different webinars and interview programming across the last 45 days, at times approaching 1,000 attendees and bringing in government agencies such as the Health District, DETR, or the Bankers Association, for example, for content relevant to the entire community. Here at the Henderson Chamber, we had very specific small business platforms, maybe revolving around human resources or tax topics relevant to the grants available through the PPP. And of course, as mentioned, we would share and cross over on these presentations, again, built in collaboration. In sum, BIN hosted nearly 100 webinars and interviews over the past 45 days, featuring at some point all of our federally elected officials. More locally, we featured mayors, council members, commission members, some of you, we thank you for that, from the various jurisdictions and state elected officials, including Governor Sisolak with the Reno Sparks Chamber. It is estimated we approached about 20,000 touch points amongst these various attendees, businesses, and community groups. There is also a tremendous focus on community, as this response is far more than business. Philanthropy and volunteerism were common themes for BIN to push out and promote. In addition to all the community-oriented PSAs that BIN produced, we placed print articles such as 7 tips for virtual volunteerism and community engagement in the Reno Gazette-Journal and a roadmap for philanthropy in the Las Vegas Sun. As Peter mentioned, COVID Kindness started in the north, and that program morphed into Switch to Kindness here in the south, a program implemented by the Vegas Chamber, Switch, and the Las Vegas Metro Police Department Foundation. Both programs designed to connect gift card donations from small business to our first responders, again, from north to south. In turn, we've gone south to north with programming, led by groups such as the Moonridge Group and Julie Murray, Projects such as Delivering with Dignity, which had provided over 20,000 fresh meals thus far to shut in medically fragile seniors who otherwise would not have had access to food. Hope Means Nevada was another example. It is a new mental wellness statewide campaign to raise awareness about the mental health challenges in these times, especially amongst our teenage population. The Henderson Chamber Foundation, in turn, through our Community Cares platform, focused on assisting driving food towards organizations, most recently partnering with Serving Our Kids Foundation to feed hungry kids at home during the pandemic. Examples of community-oriented projects such as these are numerous and ongoing. Ben continues to promote these programs and many more with a focus on philanthropy and volunteerism, again, recognizing our communities pulling together in collaboration, which is key to coming out on the other side. So with that, I'm going to hand off this presentation to Jonas Peterson, President and CEO at the Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance. Thank you.
Hey, Scott, thanks for the transition. More importantly, thanks for the partnership. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to talk a little bit about looking forward, because while we are, as a business information network, continuing to focus everything we can on responding to immediate business needs, we're also looking further down the road toward opportunities to reimagine, to strengthen, and to rebuild our economy. We know the need is going to be great. With unemployment at 25% or more, with 250,000 or more Nevadans going through unemployment insurance, it will not be enough for us simply to focus on reopening and helping existing businesses rehire. More than ever, we're going to need, as a state and as regions, to aggressively pursue new job creation strategies. There's good news here. The good news is that we believe there will be significant and unique opportunities over the next 2-3 years as we emerge out of the pandemic to create new high-wage jobs for our residents. If, and this is a big if we can make sure we have the tools, the resources, the team in place to go after those opportunities. Again, a robust economic development effort is going to be necessary. Let me share just a few examples with you where we believe there's going to be opportunity down the road. One is reshoring companies that simply no longer want to be or are willing to risk operations abroad. Another opportunity is recruiting firms from within supply chains that have been disrupted. And those firms are now looking for a new home. I think there's going to be an opportunity to build on our growing manufacturing and logistics base, surround that with complementary companies and workforce. It's been an area of strength for us. And as cost-sensitive companies look for new locations, we think we can continue to grow that base. As we move forward, we expect there to be a round of new innovative companies and startups that fill in the gaps left by others. As firms go bankrupt or discontinue, there are going to be gaps out there. Other firms are going to step in to fill those roles. We want them to be located in Nevada. All this and more, plus continuing to provide our existing firms with resources and strategy to get them through and stronger when we're on the other side of this pandemic. So you can see there's some potential huge opportunities out there if we can be aggressive over the next 2-3 years to capture those opportunities. We look forward to partnering with GoEd. We know there is planning efforts underway and starting to look at that recovery phase. We look forward to partnering with, as a business information network, with you, with other community partners to come up with the best plan possible. now more than ever, we need to be collaborative across the region, across the state. That's what the Business Information Network is all about. I think it's going to continue to serve as a powerful resource. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. And it's my pleasure to hand it back over to Betsy Fretwell to close us out.
Thank you, Jonas. So just to wrap up, one, I think you all will agree that the initial goals that were kind of laid out in those early discussions with Michael Brown have brought this Business Information Network and all of our activities to bear on GOAD as they've gone along doing their job during this response and prepare for leading us into recovery. That's helped provide information to the governor in a timely manner for him to consider as he's wrestling both the health pandemic response and the economic recovery response while balancing out those public health responsibilities. And we've also been helping the task force along the Jim Murren task force to be a communication network for them, but also as those conversations start to turn towards recovery and what that task force can do, it really opens the door for further collaboration and frankly, setting a strategic framework out. So, as we move forward, we will be continuing to be a resource and an asset to all of these different efforts. I mean, I know that Clark County's embarking on a community economic development plan shortly. The state's updating their economic development strategy through SRI to try and get a 6 to 18 month plan for state economic recovery. The RISE committee's had several conversations through the MAC. There's community groups that are springing up and talking about things on Facebook and others. I think that there's a real opportunity, depending on how the SNRPC moves forward, for us to plug into future conversations that you may have about projects of regional significance, economic recovery, obviously the nonprofit network and some of those other community support services become very relevant in all of these conversations. So first, I want to say thank you to Commissioner Jones and to Councilman Knudsen for inviting us here today to give this presentation. I want to say thanks to my teammates that are on this call and those that are not from the North that have been so incredibly gracious with their time, energy, and talents to get us this far. And I'm hopeful that we've answered a lot of questions about who we are and what we've been doing and what we're prepared to do to help not only the region, but the state recover as quickly as we can. So with that, Commissioner, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have or turn those questions over to some of the other participants in the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Fretwell, and to all the presenters. This was extremely helpful to all of us in understanding the tremendous work that you all have been doing, along with all of the other partners that were noted in helping to shape the policy and to shape the procedures that are in place to help us get to phase one and future planning in terms of dealing with our economic circumstances. At this time, I'd turn it over to the board if you have questions. Councilman Knudsen.
Thank you, Commissioner, and for everyone on the call, thank you very much. And Betsy, you've been an amazing mentor for the last many, many years, so thank you very much for providing time and energy for me. I had several questions, and Jonas, one of the things that you said was reopening is not enough, and that's been very clear to me over the many conversations I've had with the business leaders in our community, and thanks to the Vegas Chamber, I've been on several of the discussions, and in follow-up discussions with me from business owners have been about what if people don't show up to business, that reopening just isn't enough, and what is the government's role in making sure that there is consumer confidence for people to go back to their spending money in our community. And so I want to ask a question, several questions. That's one of them: is reopening is not enough. What is our role in supporting reopening in an effective way? Jonas, you also mentioned that we're going to have an aggressive approach to redefining our economy, and we need the resources and tools. And so I want to ask about what you think those resources and tools are, and the role of local government in and working with you to procure or supply those resources and tools. And then the third question, so there's three of them. The third question is, Betsy, you mentioned projects of regional significance. And I know the CARES funding and the thought right now is very dynamic and happening very quickly. What is the role of government in general to start defining or looking towards projects of regional significance, and how can we do that in a manner that meets the needs of our business community? So three questions, and I apologize for doing them all three at the same time, but one is reopening is not enough. How can we support what would be enough from a government perspective? What are the resources and tools to be aggressive in our economic recovery? And then projects of regional significance, and how is the SNRPC useful or supportive in defining and working towards those goals?
Unless you want to go first.
Yeah, so those are great questions. How about I can take a shot at the first two, and then maybe Betsy, you want to touch base on the third? That works? All right. Councilman Knudsen, thank you for the questions. The first one that I heard was this idea that the reopening is not enough. And I think that is the simple yet hard truth for us to deal with, that we are going to not only need to reopen and try and hire back, help companies hire back as many jobs as possible, but recognize that we're also going to have to replace lost jobs. Some firms are going to, unfortunately, discontinue operations, or at least not in the short run, hire back their full workforce. That is going to leave us with an unemployment rate that we need to work down. From my point of view, the strategy there is to push and push hard for new job creation. What is that? That is supporting our target industries. It is doing everything we can to attract new high wage, high job count firms to come in and fill those gaps, create new job opportunities to help compensate for those that we have lost along the way, and push us in a more positive direction. In order to do that, this gets to your second question, we're going to need a robust strategy and economic development effort. Now, what does that look like? There's still question marks here, and I think there is a team effort underway to identify the best ideas, go after them, and figure out what that will cost. But in terms of resources, we're going to need funding, staff, and tools. Now, some of this is maintaining efforts that have been successful and are currently underway, but are going to likely have funding challenges in the near term due to the downturn. So keeping up some of the great programs and some of the economic development systems we already have in place, but looking at our tools, incentives in particular. The environment has shifted. It's one thing if you have very low unemployment. It is another when you're looking at high unemployment. I think we need to be aggressive. Incentives are a part of that. Performance-based incentives that make sense, that can leave us in a revenue positive position, and still go after those high value companies are one of the critical tools we're going to have to take a look at. And then making sure we have the cooperation among entities, groups like the BIN are engaged, and our economic development organizations can maintain and deploy staff and programs at a rate that will allow us to go after the big opportunities. That would be my initial comments. Betsy, do you want to take that third question and add anything I missed?
Sure, thank you, Jonah. I think that was a pretty comprehensive answer. I would just say that I know that later on the agenda you have a presentation about the CARES Act. There's immense flexibility in that CARES Act, particularly in light of some of the recent guidance that's come down. And so that creates an opportunity for us to think about things a little bit differently than we might ordinarily because of that very rare federal flexibility. Much more flexible than what we experienced in 2008 and 2009 with the ARA funding. So this gives us an opportunity, I think, as a state and as you all as regional leaders to have a good conversation about how do we rebuild things in a smart way that prepares us for whatever this future is going to look like. And frankly, I think it's ours to develop what we want that new Nevada to look like. And so, there may be an opportunity for us to be able to employ some of those funds in unique ways to help jumpstart some of these conversations and some of these activities. That's why I think maybe Commissioner Jones asked me about the projects of regional significance. These projects of regional significance, typically we put these constructs on that it's going to be more of an infrastructure play. And I would just suggest that, the Regional Planning Coalition, which in probably more than you guys want to know, but I worked quite a bit with the authors of the Southern Nevada Strategic Planning Authority, which the SNRPC spun off from many more years ago than I would like to admit. So I know the genesis of this board was steeped in heavy regional planning. And I don't mean land use necessarily, although that was part of it. It was really about taking this community and creating a communication network and a collaboration around big projects and how they impacted the region, and how those then related to other development issues. And so this group really has a place in this conversation going forward, in my opinion, about how this economy can shape up and how we can adapt going forward with these new different resources, recognizing these new challenges and taking advantage of the ingenuity and the incredible, I'll just say, tenacity that we have in this region and in this state. So, as we look forward, I really think that the RPC, because of your composition, you have a well-rounded board that can carry on some of these conversations about projects that are going to really move the needle going forward in a way that can be addressed collaboratively among all these local governments, and utilize some of your other organizations that are already in place to help drive that conversation, or help you gather the information that you all feel would be beneficial as you embark on these public policy discussions. And frankly, you guys can move pretty quickly because as one board, you're able to bring in a lot of viewpoints. So it might be easier to get really quickly to a really fine point on things that may require quite a bit of speed and agility. So there are a lot of benefits, I think, to having some of these conversations at the Regional Planning Coalition level, based on its composition and its history and its mission. And I think these projects of regional significance that are being discussed as a part of the upcoming infrastructure package, and I'm not an expert on that, but based on what we're hearing from our lobbyists that Mary Beth talked about, there's going to be real potential there for us to do things differently and maybe address some issues that have been a challenge, but we've been unable to figure out a way to fund them. So with that, I will be quiet and be happy to answer any other questions that the board may have.
Thank you very much to Jonas and to Betsy for the responses. Councilman, do you have any other questions? Okay. Councilwoman Seaman?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to know if I could get a hard copy of your presentation. Is that possible?
Sure.
Okay. And then I would like to know, have you contacted anybody else from the city of Las Vegas or consulted with them about this creation of this presentation? About your thoughts on your plans?
On the presentation itself, Councilwoman, or do you mean the activities?
Well, basically on your thoughts about using CARES funding, or have you contacted anyone else from the city of Las Vegas?
I don't know that our group has had a real formal conversation about that. There have been several conversations that have unfolded over the last I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks, as there's kind of this specter of funding coming forward. But no, there have not been formal conversations with all the local governments. I know that there are some conversations that are underway at the local government level, but not a specific outreach, no.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Sigelblum.
Thank you. With respect to current economic development efforts, are they tied to any taxes, sales tax or room taxes which look like they're going to be significantly lower, which means that the current efforts are, unless we do something, they're going to be substantially less?
Commissioner, I'll attempt to answer that. There's no direct funding for the Chamber of Commerce or LVGEA or the Latin Chamber of Commerce. All of the participating groups have membership-based organizations to a great degree. Some receive funding from the state, and so those funds would be your traditional state resources, but those are allocated during a traditional budget process. So I think the short answer is no, but there is some tangential impact of a decrease in revenues at the local and state level that may impact the ability for those organizations to continue their memberships.
All right. Any questions on this side? All right. On the phone, I know we had Councilman Churchio who joined us. Is there anyone on the phone that had questions for this panel?
I had some difficulty logging in.
Thank you for joining us, Councilman. Okay. If any questions from the council, folks? Okay. All right. If you do have questions, then unmute yourselves and go ahead and speak. If not, then we will move on. All right. Hearing no questions from those on the phone, we wanted to give a great shout out and thank you to the folks from the various chambers and from the Business Information Network, LVGA, for your participation here. I think it was very beneficial to us as we look at what types of roles the Southern Nevada Regional Planning Coalition might play in the recovery efforts as we go forward. So thank you very much for being with us. All right, at this time, we'll move on to agenda item number 7, which is to receive a presentation regarding federal legislation providing economic relief from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I believe we have Ms. Brune.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you for being with us, Nancy.
Of course, thanks for having me. I believe I sent the presentation over to Mario, so it should be loading shortly.
Yep, we have it up.
And then shall I just say next slide? Because I can't see what's on the screen. There we go. Okay, so I'll just say next slide. All right, so thank you for the opportunity to present. I was asked to just share a couple of remarks about the CARES Act and then maybe provide some context with the history of federal grants in Nevada, and then some strategies or recommendations for moving forward as the money continues to flow from the feds down to the states. So next slide, please. So just to provide a 101 on the different pots of money that are part of the CARES Act, because sometimes there's confusion about the different pots. It is the case that, there's sort of 6 pots, and 4 of them are pretty fixed with what they are allocated to support. So the first big one is the Paycheck Protection Program. For that, it's about $342 billion. Because there was such tremendous demand, they actually a couple of weeks ago released a second tranche of funding. So the total is about $575 billion. Nevada, I have a slide later on, but just the high level is Nevada received 4 billion in PPP loan assistance across about 31,000 loans, or 31,000 small businesses were able to access the PPP program. Title II is the assistance for businesses and families, and that is the extra unemployment assistance that we've heard about, the $600 that supplements existing state unemployment benefits, as well as the on average 1,200 benefits per family, depending on income of the family. So I think that pot's around 500 billion. And the third pot has to deal with health, education, and labor provisions. And so I think there's about 100 billion in this pot, for example, to purchase PPE equipment. This includes provisions related to education and Pell Grants, and how students that receive both work study funding as well as Pell Grants can seek some relief with CARES Act. And then the fourth big bucket was assistance to distressed industries. And this is about 500 billion. And this is where, the assistance to the airline industry, where that assistance was budgeted. Next slide, please. So then the two next buckets that more directly relate to some of the conversations we've had today. The first one is Title V, the Title V bucket, and that is the coronavirus relief funds. And in this bucket, we saw $150 billion allocated for state and local governments. When all is said and done, or was said and done, and they took out money for administrative costs and DC, it's about $130 billion that has been distributed or dispersed to states and local governments. It's at a very minimum based on a population. Each state was guaranteed about a little over 1 billion. So Nevada, as we know, is not a state with tremendous population. So we got the minimum, which is about $1.25 billion. And the for distribution within that bucket is about 830 for the state, 830,000 for the state, about 280 million for Clark County, and 160 million for City of Las Vegas. And I apologize, that should be million, not thousand. So I don't want to send off any alarm bells. And so the conditions of the funding that was dispersed to state and local governments is that it's got to be related to necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency. It's got to be for expenditures that were not already accounted for in state and local government budgets as of March 27th. And it allows for expenditures that have been realized from the period of March 1st through the end of the year. It does allow for second order effects. So if there are programs that are designed to address the fact that folks have either business disruptions or employment disruptions as a result of COVID-19, there is money, or local governments are allowed to stand up programs or make expenditures, realize expenditures for sort of second order effects of COVID-19. Next slide, please. And I apologize, this slide is hard to read, but the sixth bucket, sort of titled miscellaneous funds. And in summary, there are about 64 appropriations that will involve about 64 different departments. There's very sort of, the high level is that included in these miscellaneous funds are a little over 100 billion for hospitals and veterans health care, 45 billion for FEMA disaster relief fund, 16 billion for strategic national stockpile, 4.3 billion for the Centers for Disease Control, and then 11 billion for vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and other medical needs. And then there are also breakouts by the different appropriations subcommittees. So I know one that that's of interest to some of the conversations here in Southern Nevada are there's about 48 billion allocated through the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Subcommittee. So those items. Briefly, some folks have estimated Nevada stands to receive about $1 billion from this pool of funds, and it's going to be a combination, or the funds will be dispersed through a combination of formula-based grants as well as some discretionary spending. So, for example, just last week or about 10 days ago, the U.S. Department of Education announced 2 new grants. One was related to sort of ways to support students and families who have had an educational disruption. And so how can we think about rolling out more extensive online platforms to make sure that students are connected to educational services and instructional programming. The other discretionary grant program had to deal with standing up new innovative CTE, career and technical education programs. And again, it's discretionary, so all states are able to put a grant together and go after that money. One recent development that we've learned is that it looks like some of this money, even when it's discretionary, the federal agencies will be putting together sort of a coronavirus burden index. And so even if a state were to submit an application or grant application, the feds may score that application through this lens or through a matrix of a coronavirus burden index. We've actually, because Governor Sisolak implemented the stay-at-home order so quickly, we've actually been less affected than some of the other states. And so there are many other states that have realized greater deaths and cases of COVID-19. So if the feds reviews that coronavirus burden index, Nevada may not score as high as another state for some of these competitive applications, simply because we've done a better job of closing early and trying to mitigate the widespread of coronavirus or COVID-19. Next slide. And something else I wanted to share about these particular funds. Again, they will be both discretionary but also formula-based. McKinsey Company did an analysis looking at the different funds that were available, and they argue that 10% of these funds will be allocated to programs that will simply require an augmentation of existing benefit programs that state and local governments already have. And so in that sense, it wouldn't require any new capacity or any new investment from state and local governments to take advantage and to execute and implement that particular program or that funding opportunity. About 65 to 75% of the funds, again, under this particular bucket, would likely require states and local governments to revisit and or amend the way they allocate and disperse funding to third-party service providers or even nonprofits. And so McKinsey was arguing that this actually could require additional capacity. And sort of one data point or one way to think about this is the IFC process that we have here in the state. A lot of times for grants, for federal grants, it has to go through the IFC process, and sometimes that adds an additional layer of timing. And so what could we be doing both at the local level and the state level to ensure that we are streamlining our processes, looking at ways to both secure and then disperse money in a much more streamlined effective, timely way.
Ms. Breen,
And
can you
then
clarify on at the local government level, what types of modifications might, I understand the IFC process at the state level is a potential hurdle. At the local government level, are there specific instances in which we need to be cognizant of changing the way we do things in order to qualify for grants?
I think the simple answer is yes. We've just started looking at what those could be, Commissioner Jones.
Okay, thank
So
you.
I don't have specifics right now, but yes, I think we should, that's something potentially that this committee could look at, or sorry, this coalition could look at, or other groups. And then the final point is that about 25% of the funds, according to McKinsey, would require significant investment in new capabilities. And so with that, I want to just go to the next slide and make a point and sort of provide some context why it's really important, and this it could be a target of opportunity or conversation for this committee to look at the fact that securing and then implementing some of these grant programs or grant funds coming through CARES would actually require significant investment in capabilities. So before I move to the next slide, I wanted to put up a quote by Dr. Carl Sagan. You have to know the past to understand the present. Next slide. So for better or worse, and one thing that the Gwynn Center has spoken about quite frequently over the last few years, and we've been proud to partner with the Nevada Community Foundation and Southern Nevada Strong and United Way, led in part by Chief of Staff Miles Dixon, who is now at the State Treasurer's Office, is that historically Nevada has not done a great job securing federal grants. So, you know, on any given Tuesday, to quote my friend, we're not good at federal grants. It's unrealistic to think that all of a sudden when we're responding to crisis and our state administrative structure is, and our local state apparatus, our local apparatus is so taxed that we'd be good at responding to the opportunities coming down at rapid speed with from the CARES Act. And so this slide just looks at over time how Nevada has done. We're comparing Nevada to the Intermountain West, how well we've done looking, securing all federal financial assistance on a per capita basis, taking into account that our population, you know, is not as big as California. So in total sum, we wouldn't expect to have as much federal financial assistance from the federal government because California is just bigger. On a population basis, in federal fiscal year 2017, we ranked 48th out of 51 because they include the District of Columbia in federal financial assistance per capita. Utah almost consistently does worse than Nevada, so thank goodness for Utah. So that is all federal financial assistance. So that includes grants, but also benefits, etc., contract work. Next slide, please.
Nancy, real quick, what are Arizona and New Mexico doing right that we're doing wrong?
We have looked at New Mexico, and I think a lot of it, I can't explain Arizona, but our analysis of New Mexico, sadly, it is because the poverty in New Mexico is dramatic, worse than the poverty in Nevada. And so for those programs that take into account or weight the level of poverty in the state, New Mexico gets a few bumps up. So it's sort of a bad position to be in, but rightfully they simply, because it's a very poor state, they do receive more federal assistance than Nevada. Great question, thank you. Next slide, please. And then looking at grants specifically, we also, again, don't fare very well among our Intermountain West state partners or peers. We were in federal fiscal year 2017, we ranked 44th in the country in federal grants per capita. You do see in 2015, there was a slight bump up, and that is because we expanded Medicaid. Again, Texas and Utah do fare more poorly than we do. But again, we're at the bottom in federal grants per capita. Next slide, please. And then this slide just compares our grants with all other federal funds. And so of all the federal assistance that Nevada receives, a small portion is given to us through grants. Next slide, please. And I know this was a historical perspective, but I also want to show that even when we look at recent data and sort of the first round of CARES Act funding, Nevada struggled. And so the very first round, we actually ranked 50th, just above California, in the number or the percentage of small businesses that received PPP loans. After the first tranche, only 3.2% of Nevada's small businesses had received Paycheck Protection Program loan assistance. The national average was about 5%. Compared to Utah, these are our peers, and again, this was the first round. Utah had about 7 or 8% of their small businesses receive PPPs, compared to Nevada at 3.2%. Now, we did do a paper on this, and there are some structural issues as to why Nevada ranked or didn't do as well. In part, that had to do with the fact that we have a very underbanked system here in Nevada. So we have fewer numbers of banks helping our small businesses, and a lot of the big banks, as we've heard, set caps at 10 million, and then closed doors to new customers. A lot of banks only process transactions for existing customers. So fortunately, after the second round, we looked at the data. We did better. So 11% of our small businesses did receive PPP loan assistance. Overall, we ranked 44th in the country in the percentage of small businesses that receive PPP loans. In terms of the average size, we didn't do too badly. We ranked 22nd, and actually the first round, I think we're in the top 7 in terms of the average size of the PPP loan. So the takeaway is, while a small number of our businesses actually receive PPP assistance, the average loan size was much higher than the national average. And then finally, after the first and second round of funding from PPP, the CARES Act, we ranked 33rd in total value of loans and 36th in total number of PPP loans. And this slide just shows a comparison with our peers based on population and the number of small businesses. Next slide, please. So looking at this and thinking about capacity, I really appreciate hearing all the great work and the conversations that are going on across the state with the Nevada Business Information Network and MAC and RISE. And I know there are lots of folks really focused on moving Nevada in the right direction. So I think we have a lot to work with. I think there are some things that we could do to maximize our ability to secure CARES funding. One strategy or recommendation would be to invest in grant writing capacity. A couple of interesting data points. If you go back to or if you recall the last slide, Kansas outperformed us both in the first and the second round of PPP funding. Their Department of Commerce hired 10 grant writers the day that, or leading up to the PPP program being executed, just to help work on processing business applications so that their small businesses could go after PPP funding. So it sounds simple, but a lot of our agencies don't have adequate grant writing capacity currently. I know, for example, GOED, it turns out, is looking at the Department of Education opportunity that I mentioned that referenced starting a new career technical education program in a sort of a new pathway that would address the workforce needs as it relates to public health capacity. From my knowledge, I don't know if GOED's ever had a grant writer on staff, but if a lot of those grants are going to come through GOED, it would be great to support them, find out what their grant writing capacity needs are, and provide technical support just to help our agencies respond to these grants. One of the other data points that we mentioned in our paper is that Nevada ranks 43rd in state apparatus. So we have about 42 state workers for every 10,000 residents. We rank 43rd in the country. When we compare that to Alaska, they have 245 state workers for every 10,000 residents. And so I want us to be mindful that we are asking our county governments and our state governments to respond in light speed, and they have a very bare-boned state apparatus. And so to the extent possible, as much as groups like this, nonprofit groups, philanthropy, informal business networks can support these grant writing efforts, I think that would go a long way to helping Nevada secure some of these funds. The other recommendation is that I know we have lots of conversations, but really moving to develop and identify a state and regional strategy to help align and coordinate going after grants, but then also the implementation of programs. Utah, it's almost the poster child for very robust, stellar response to COVID-19, has a Utah strategy. They also have a task force very similar to the one that Jim Urin leads. And I'll come back to this later, but they have, as part of their task force, they've established several working groups. One of those working groups is specifically dedicated to looking at federal assistance and how Utah can mobilize and work to go after as much federal assistance as they can through the CARES Act. Another recommendation is to identify and establish a cohort of state and regional leaders to coordinate and track grant applications and deadlines. One of the things that we're finding informally is that there isn't a clearinghouse, so we don't know who is applying for grants. And so when I reached out to CSN to ask them whether they were applying for the Department of Ed grant, one of their faculty members or staff members did not realize that, yes, CSN had already been involved. I was working with GOED. This is an NSHE GOED-led effort. But it'd be great, I think it'd be helpful to have a central location where we can coordinate across cities, counties, and the state to find out who is applying for grants, to coordinate the applications and the deadlines, and also to track how successful we are. Right now, there isn't a body that is tracking whether or not we actually apply and then are successful in receiving some of this money. And then finally, I would recommend that we explore, or this committee explore, standing up a federal assistance working group. That could be under the auspices of SNRPC or the task force that Jim Urin leads, or even the Nevada Business Information Network. I don't want to give more work to Betsy. They're doing a tremendous effort, but clearly it would behoove our state for someone to actually explicitly take ownership of federal assistance procurement and implementation and monitoring. And with that, I will stop. Next slide. I just want to end on a positive note. Next slide, which will be my last. So thinking about the future, I just wanted to end with a positive quote from Thomas Jefferson. I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. So I know we've struggled securing federal grants as a state, but I think this is a new day, a new opportunity. And as Betsy and Jonas and others have said so eloquently, there's a lot of great energy and a lot of collaboration. And so I think we've got the elements for really taking advantage of the opportunities and building the new Nevada. So with that, I will stop and entertain any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brune. It was very educational and gives us some concrete ideas for what this coalition could be doing in assisting in the efforts to address the economic impacts of COVID-19. Are there questions from the committee? Councilwoman Seaman?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I would love to get a copy of it if I could.
Yes, happy to send one to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Commissioner Segerblum?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nancy, you didn't mention the Federal Reserve's bond program that we heard testimony on earlier in the week. Nevada or Clark County could get several $100 million from. Was that intentional oversight, or you weren't aware of that one?
I am going to, I don't know if I could offer anything additional than what was shared already. I know the last time I spoke with Mr. Hobbs about the bonding opportunity or bonding capacity opportunity, they were in conversations to figure out or identify some of the constraints and what was going to be permissible. So I will defer to the real bond experts in the region.
Nancy, this is Brian Knudsen. Thank you very much for the presentation, and it's nice to hear your voice again. I know we've crossed paths several times talking about federal assistance in the state of Nevada, and there's just a couple of points and connections that I wanted to make from the previous presentation. One was that projects of regional significance, which I think deserves greater attention. And two, you mentioned this a couple times, that the CARES funding in particular provides opportunities that'll come down at a rapid speed. So I think those are incredibly important, especially for this body, for the SNRPC. Your recommendations are spot on, and I appreciate them. Are you aware of other groups that are working on increasing our grant writing capacity as a region or as a state, specifically looking at some of those things that you recommended?
Thank you for the question, Councilman Knudsen. It's also good to see you again. There are informal conversations happening across the state. I know that this is an issue at the forefront of the state treasurer's office. I know a couple of us have just volunteered and called people and offered to write grants. I think the takeaway is that it's great that a couple of us are doing it as volunteers, but clearly to move the needle and to be successful, we need institutional support and resources directed at this effort.
Can I ask one more question, unrelated? And I don't know if you can speak to this or not. Are you familiar with the need or the requirement around regional plans, like the SEDS plan that Betsy mentioned, the Southern Nevada Strong plan that we have in our community? How useful or likely are those as points of interest from a federal funding perspective?
I think they can be jumping off points. I'm not sure whether any of the applications or the grants would actually require you to submit a regional plan as evidence or as a requirement of part of the grant. But as we know, I think this is a great opportunity to work more collaboratively across the regions. As we've seen, public health crises and economic crises do not stop at jurisdictional borders. And so as much as we can come together as a region and as a state to integrate and to identify a single strategy or a number of strategies that have regional integration and are done in alignment, I think we will be more successful and it will help move Nevada forward.
Councilwoman Bridges? No, just push it once.
Just what?
Just push it once and it'll be red.
It's not. The next one.
Oh, no, it's on. It's on.
Oh,
Good.
there, it worked. Hi. Claudia Bridges here. First of all, I would also like to get a copy of your presentation. And secondly, I am a grant writer for a nonprofit in Boulder City, Emergency Aid of Boulder City, and have had to just pay attention to every email that comes out every day and say, okay, we got to jump on that one, jump on that one. I'm looking forward to a solution. to hearing what those are going to be, because we've had a heck of a time I would love to offload what I do on a volunteer basis for them to someone else, and had a heck of a time finding anybody who's willing to do that, especially on a volunteer basis. But because I know that money's out there. I mean, we got $57,000 for emergency aid from the United Way grants, and it's just been a matter of paying attention. And it's not that complicated, but it has to be done. But thank you, because I don't think many people realize how much need there is for that right now.
Councilman Shaw.
Yes, Nancy, thank you for your presentation. Has there been any discussion about fixing some of the technical problems that are inherent in these programs when they come on very rapidly? One that I'm getting from my small business constituents a lot is that during the time lag from when they applied for the PPP program and they actually got the loan, most of their employees applied for unemployment. So the unemployment that they receive is in excess of what they make in the business. Well, in order for the small business to have forgiveness of that loan, they have to keep all those employees employed. And those employees don't want to come back to work because they'd have to take a pay cut to come back to work. They want to stay on unemployment. So that puts both the employee in a bind and the employer in a bind, because he can't get forgiveness unless they come back to work, and if they come back to work, they take a pay cut. So has there been a discussion about how to solve that issue?
I would encourage you to reach out to our congressional delegation. I've heard the similar stories across the valley, and so I imagine that this very issue has been brought to the attention of our congressional delegates. It is true that with a lot of grants there is, or sort of programs, there sometimes is an opportunity to weigh in and provide public input on regulations or have sort of discourse about how this looks when it's implemented. It may be the case because the federal government is just trying to, disperse the money and push it out, that we won't have the time to have those conversations. And so I imagine that there could be, we will encounter more sort of technical mismatches along the way with some of these grant programs. But I know one of the recommendations too, coming out of McKinsey, is that if we don't already have strong relationships with those federal agencies, now would be a great time to pick up the phone, get on the radar, get on a first name basis so that we can strengthen those relationships with the federal agencies.
Right. My next question probably involves you a little bit, but probably more involves Chairman Jones. The county got $280 million based primarily on population that's allocated amongst all of us sitting here. And we have a very good relationship with them. We want to maintain that spirit of cooperation. And so we are hopeful that there's some method of transparency that all of the cities here are treated in the same fashion as to how we allocate expenses with whatever programs we mutually agree on. And if there's funds left over after we've paid those expenses, how we divide those up fairly amongst ourselves, because I doubt that there's any instruction within the program as to how that happens.
And I appreciate you bringing that up, and that was one of the things that I think we were hoping to be part of the discussion today. I think that there needs to be collaboration amongst the three jurisdictions that got funds, the state, the county, and the city of Las Vegas, because the only way we're going to leverage those dollars the best is to do it in collaboration. Part of the discussion we had at the county was that the state said that they didn't want to push money down to the jurisdictions that were smaller than 500,000 people, but we didn't really have confirmation of that. Obviously, the population was what the dollars were calculated on by the federal government. So I think the SNRPC ought to play a role in those discussions, but the state also has to be involved. The city has to be involved in those discussions because we're not going to be able to accomplish as much with the 1.25 billion that we collectively received as the state of Nevada unless we coordinate with one another. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
How do we get everyone to the table? I guess that's one question, because obviously we're under 500,000, so
Yep.
we're at everybody's mercy. You know?
Understood. And I can tell you that Councilman Knudsen and I and many others on the phone and in other positions have had ongoing discussions with the treasurer's office, trying to understand things from their perspective, and with others in the governor's office. I know our county chair, Marilyn Kirkpatrick, has been in daily conversations with the governor's office on these ongoing issues. But I think everybody sort of has their hair on fire right now and hasn't had a chance to sit back and really think through how are we going to best spend these dollars that we have. And I think the good news is that I can't speak for the city of Las Vegas, but I don't think that any of us have spent the money yet. So I think there's still opportunity to have those discussions.
I can tell you we haven't spent the money. So.
Understood.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep. On the phone, anyone want to ask questions of Ms. Brune? All right, hearing none. Thank you very much, Nancy, for your excellent presentation. If you could send the presentation to the committee, to Mario, and then he can distribute it to the members of the committee, that would be fantastic. All right, we're going to skip over agenda item number 8 because I think agenda item number 9 is related to the COVID-19 discussion that we've been having. And I believe we have Mr. Rayborn.
Yes, Chair. I promised I wouldn't ask if you can hear me, so I'm just going to say sound check.
Check, check, check. We can hear you.
Okay, good. Thanks. All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for inviting me today. And thanks also to all the staff members and members of the public who are joining today's meeting. For those on the call, I'm Craig Rayborn. I'm the director of the RTC's Metropolitan Planning Organization, and we administer the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan on behalf of the SNRPC. So last week I was asked to present the plan as it relates to economic recovery efforts. And as you know, and we're all experiencing, we've had some significant disruptions in the short term to global and local economies, to our transportation system, and the outbreak has changed life as we know it, at least temporarily. And so today I'm just going to discuss the Southern Nevada Strong Plan in that context, and some of my team's and our agency's current and future regional planning activities. So next slide. So I think most people at this meeting or watching already know most of the fundamentals of the SNS plan. So I'm just going to briefly remind about some of the most relevant elements in this context. So first, I want to emphasize that the role and function for a plan like Southern Nevada Strong is to identify the recommendations for the long-term outcomes. A plan like this isn't really built to make recommendations about immediate needs, for the next 6, 12, or 18 months. Instead, it's intended to look over the horizon at the actions that can be taken over the next 2 to 3 or up to 20 years out, so that the region becomes stronger and more resilient to shocks and crises like what we're now facing. Second point I would make is that Southern Nevada Strong was built in very large part to guide a long-term recovery for Southern Nevada from the last economic crisis. The top issues in a 2013 poll, so sort of contemporary to the Great Recession, that was done for the Southern Nevada Strong Project. Again, those top issues were jobs, economy, and schools. Others like land use and housing and transportation were also important, but those were secondary. And those goals, those issues became the long-term recovery focused elements that the SNS plan concentrated on. Third, it would be that Southern Nevada Strong reflects very broad community stakeholder involvement. There was an extensive community engagement process. More than 70,000 touch points were part of Southern Nevada Strong. The effort was significant enough that the region, the plan won a National Planning Award from the American Planning Association for its engagement. It's a pretty good indicator of the level of success that was included in that. And then I'd also just note that as a community-driven project, there were groups and task forces throughout the plan development that represented stakeholders and experts from the community looking at economic development issues, housing issues, education, equity, transportation, environment, public health, and quite a few other topics. So what all this means is that the Southern Nevada Strong Plan reflects exactly what Southern Nevadans said they wanted and needed in the recovery and aftermath of the Great Recession. So you can probably draw some parallels there to the kind of long-term questions that we want to start asking. And then finally, I just say that Southern Nevada Strong envisioned a really wide distribution of roles for stakeholders to implement those recommendations. The plan was agreed to in 2015. Then the RTC agreed to administer the plan, to promote it, to logically build on it, and to help build the capacity for others to implement it. And so, most of the recommendations in the plan, and I'm just going to cover a very small number of examples today, they have different stakeholders identified to lead them. So frequently the local governments, but also other regional institutions or non-governmental stakeholders as well. Can we go to the next slide? So the pieces of the Southern Nevada Strong fit together very well to build the kind of strength and resilience that the plan was trying to accomplish. Regional planners like me, we think about a region as a system that really consists of three main parts: the people and what their needs are so that they can thrive, the economy and what it needs in order to thrive, and then the infrastructure, the resources, the transportation system, the environment that help the others thrive. And so when those three elements are all working together, and all the things that they consist of are working together, and they're supportive of each other, then the region itself is a stronger region. So these four main themes that you see here, they address each of those elements. As I noted earlier, you all know most of these fundamentals, so I don't want to go into those again in detail. But like as just one example for how the plan elements pull together and address all the pieces of the region, those elements, the people, economy, and infrastructure. One of those, the third theme, increasing transportation choice, it's obviously related to infrastructure, but it includes recommendations that are related to making the region more attractive to future businesses, improving roads and public transit to make travel easier for residents and visitors, and then making directly linking transportation projects to economic development outcomes. Can we go to the next slide? So what I'm going to do now is highlight how the plan translates those themes into specific recommendations and then eventually into outcomes. With about 350 specific recommendations in the plan, there's obviously, there's not time in this presentation to go through all of them. So I'm really just going to discuss a few, just 3 or 4 or so. And the ones that I'm going to review today are chosen mostly to highlight the range of topics, how they apply in today's context, and then to give a sense of all the relevant issues that are touched upon by the Southern Nevada Strong Plan. So, my decision to include them is not intended to indicate that, that I or that the RTC thinks that these should be priorities, but just rather to demonstrate some examples so that I can put them into context and sort of show what all is in the plan. The plan's implementation strategy is set up in a fairly typical format. It has themes, and then underneath each of the themes are goals, as you can see here for the first theme. And then with each one of the goals, there are a number of objectives, and then for each of the objectives, there are a number of recommendations. And so the first example that I'll discuss is a specific objective under the first goal that you can see here of matching land use and transportation plans. And then I'll explain kind of why it's relevant. So this is an objective about investing in and maintaining infrastructure so that it meets the needs of a diversified economy. And the specific recommendation is to assess the need for and implement infrastructure that can support a diversified economy, and then to recommend updates to land use and transportation plans. So you kind of see how that's not something that we do for the next 6 or 12 months. That's a longer term kind of outcome, but it builds the strength and sustainability for the region. And an objective like the one I just said has a lead identified. It's actually the Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance. And then other participants would include all of the local governments as well as the RTC. We identify a minimal fiscal impact for that one, and then a time frame of 3 to 6 years. As an example of the kinds of things that can be touched on with this, we've been having conversations with the City of Henderson and Nevada Department of Transportation about interchanges to I-15 in West Henderson. Those are something that, they're not going to be implemented in the very near term of an economic recovery, but they have been identified as a long-term need for the region and for Henderson's economic development. And so that's why they're relevant as in sort of this context of talking about what, future types of infrastructure needs would be and how we address them through the planning process. Another objective also under this first theme, and then the third goal of emboldening small businesses to participate in revitalization, relates to using existing building supply so that startups and small businesses, entrepreneurs can help revitalize existing areas of the community, sort of building on the previous investments that have been made in the region. So the specific recommendation there, again, just as an example of what's in the plan, would be identifying neighborhoods that are well positioned to attract businesses from specific sectors and develop place-based strategies and outreach efforts around those areas so that they can reduce commute times and connect local residents to job opportunities. This is intended to support the development of locally focused small businesses that would need to be an important part of the region's recovery. So recognizing these considerations can help make the region, or can help the region make decisions in the near-term recovery process that would then reinforce these longer-term outcomes. There are also other recommendations, for example, under this theme that address local businesses, small businesses, workforce development, primary, secondary, and higher education, property rehabilitation, commercial activities, and many, many more interests. So as an example for like what all is in the plan, this particular theme has the 5 goals you can see right now. Under those goals, there are a total of 10 different objectives. And then under those objectives, there are 46 specific recommendations. And each one of those recommendations has an identified lead stakeholder, as well as other participants that would be interested or interested parties or it would be necessary to play a supportive role in order for the recommendations to be successful. Can we go to the next slide? So next one, I'll just do the same basic exercise, but just showing a couple examples under the second theme of investing in complete communities. So you can see again, this is a theme of the plan that has 5 goals. Quite a bit more after that, though. It has 23 specific objectives under those 5 goals, and then 118 recommendations to achieve those goals and to help address this theme. So first one I'll talk about is just an objective to develop housing and employment in mixed-use neighborhoods near job centers, schools, and other services. So the specific recommendation is then to develop regional goals and standards that aim to reduce transportation costs and provide increased mobility in neighborhoods to everyday amenities such as grocery stores, offices, and schools. I don't even know if a comment is necessary on this because it's reducing household costs, but it's pretty well established that transportation costs make up a substantial part of most household expenses, and that the proportion for lower income households is usually greater than for higher income ones. And so anything that can be done in the near term, like the RTC's current fare collection policy, is important and helpful, but planning now to better facilitate this type of recommendation in the future will result in housing options that have lower transportation costs for residents, and therefore gives them a stronger ability to withstand economic shocks and stresses. The next one, just the last example I'll give for specific recommendations, is from one of the objectives that is to increase safety of neighborhoods, parks, and open spaces. And then the specific recommendation is to pursue the creation of community development organizations and community development efforts to ensure that there are nonprofit organizations based in local neighborhoods working to build safety, community pride, and reinvestment projects. So these types of programs increase the number of resources that are available for residents trying to help themselves, their neighbors, and their neighborhoods recover, and in the future, then be resistant to economic shocks and stresses. So, and then another benefit from implementing a recommendation like this is that it would build organizational capacity and expertise for addressing a wide variety of really highly localized needs and concerns, and then probably make delivery of resources more efficient or effective at that kind of micro level. Next slide, please. So the RTC's regional planning activities at this moment are really intended to make us a resource for the stakeholders that are implementing or preparing to implement their parts of the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan. So these activities include kind of what you can see here, adapting, first would be adapting our current work program so that those projects can have a little bit more relevance to some of these unanticipated needs that we're about to start facing. So, for example, one of the projects we're working on now is an extreme heat events coordinated plan, and so we're adding a little bit of discussion in that to the additional effects that are caused by social distancing during extreme heat events, and making sure that that gets worked into the plan. And so we're taking steps like that to try to adapt what we're working on to make them relevant to right now. We're working to acknowledge the flexibility within the plan. So, Southern Nevada Strong Plan, it presents a broad vision, but there's flexibility in the strategies and tactics. The plan is not a mandate. And so it's important to remember that the implementation can be flexible based on current needs. And this flexibility reminds me also just to point out that the early and middle days of a crisis are not usually the time to start, like trying to revise a long-range plan, but they can be really good times to learn about what the priorities are and then start thinking about how a future update might take place. Start identifying opportunities. So not right now, but soon, it's going to be time for stakeholders across the region to ask, what don't we want to go back to normal, and then work as a region to start figuring out the ways to sort of reboot in a way that keeps the things we want, but reduces the things or the outcomes that we don't want. And so that's part of what we're preparing to help with as well. Technical assistance, that technical help, we do that all along, but I just pointed out, the RTC and our regional planning team can help with engagement. We can help, ask questions that matter to people and try to provide as much assistance to the local stakeholders for the plan as possible. Another thing that we're working on is starting to measure what matters. Trying to focus our efforts not on scoring whether particular partners in the plan have been implementing their parts of the plan, but instead try to start focusing on measuring and tracking the long-term outcomes that the region has identified, and then identifying the gaps that we can work with stakeholders on to most effectively address those needs. And then another activity that isn't on the slide, but is always an important part of making a regional plan useful and relevant, is prioritizing the recommendations. Like I said, there are 350 recommendations in this plan. There's a whole lot there. And trying to find the things that need to be prioritized for short, mid, and long range efforts by the stakeholders would be a really important part in helping the plan achieve the successful outcomes that it was designed for. So the MPO team, we will reach out and work with any of the stakeholders to identify those recommendations that are most important to them, help them prioritize them, and then help develop the strategies along with them for implementing those priorities over the next few years or even beyond them. One thing I want to stress too is that the RTC's activities, in administering the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan, they will not be decided and taken in a vacuum. The success of SNS has always been and will continue to be the community and regional effort that kind of pulls together, having substantial and ongoing dialogue between all the stakeholders in order to achieve the outcomes. Next slide then. So that really concludes the presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me today. The RTC MPO looks forward to working with all of the stakeholders, all of the local agencies represented on this board, to help address Southern Nevada's current and future needs. And I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Craig, for your presentation and for the reminder that we do already have a plan, a framework based on the last recession of items that we can and should be doing in order to improve our economy here. Are there any specific recommendations from the SNS plan that, had they been implemented better or were further along in implementation, that would have made it less likely that this current economic crisis would have been as devastating?
It's difficult to answer such a hypothetical. I'm inclined to say that there are certainly things that could have been more implemented by almost everyone that in hindsight would have been able to help keep the region a bit more resilient. But the reality is the impacts that we're feeling are being felt all over the country. So as in the near term, at least, I wouldn't think that there's much that would address that.
Great. Other questions from the committee or from the coalition? Councilman Knudsen?
Craig, thanks for the presentation. I just wanted, I don't know if you were listening to the previous two presentations. The point that I try to carry across is that projects of regional significance and the rapid speed at which funding will become available to a region. Given the Southern Nevada Strong Plan and your expertise in regional planning, do you have thoughts around projects of regional significance and the role of the SNRPC?
Well, I think that the efforts to coordinate the grant writing that was being talked about in the previous presentation, I think it would be very helpful for SNRPC to play a role. Just like we heard previously, the SNRPC can be fairly nimble in pulling together the jurisdictional stakeholders and making decisions and trying to support and demonstrate support at the regional level when there are projects and opportunities that have that regional significance.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Bridges.
Sorry. Yeah, I have wanted to comment on one line you said that what don't we want to go back to as normal. Has there been any discussion on that? I mean, I wrote down environmental impact as something that I'm very interested in. I was very excited that it only took me 35 minutes to get down here from Boulder City today. With little traffic and the air looks nice and clean but has there been any other discussion of what people don't want to go back to as normal?
We haven't been involved in any of those discussions yet. I think it takes time for those to develop. But the one thing I will say is that the experience you just highlighted of the shorter commute time is one of the side effects of the slowdown and the decrease in the amount of travel activity that the RTC has documented and been reporting on kind of demonstrate that. And that leads to faster travel time. As the economy picks up again, there will be more travel, more activity, and some of those benefits will, they'll start to diminish. But some of them may stay. At least at the national level, there's been a fair amount of discussion about the benefits that all of the telework that has been accomplished has been achieving. So, for example, some of my colleagues at other MPOs have been talking about starting a process to establish different telework goals for their regions. So, talking even about doubling, tripling, quadrupling the pre-COVID telecommuting rates, and then trying to quantify what the benefits would be. I mean, as people have learned that they can work effectively remotely, that has started to trickle down into other realizations of potential benefits. And frankly, I suspect there'll be quite a few of those opportunities that start to be identified as people continue to sort of examine what is changing for them right now.
Great. Any questions from the councilman on the phone?
Could I follow up on that last?
Oh, sure. Commissioner Segelblum?
So looking at that, trying to promote telework, or whatever you want to call it, have you thought of things that we can do to encourage that? I mean, do we need to build our infrastructure with the internet and other things? Is that something we could look to try to get going?
Yeah, there are going to be a lot of potential co-benefits that come out of this as people start addressing the gaps that we're starting to find. For example, we've been learning about some infrastructure gaps for broadband access, Wi-Fi access across the region, and as those start to be addressed to potentially help students who are distance learning, there could easily be also opportunities for that to strengthen the ability for people whose jobs permit it for them to telework. So yeah, there are going to be opportunities like that start to arise too.
Great. If there are no further questions, then thank you very much, Mr. Rayborn, for your presentation. And we will move on to agenda item number 8, to receive a presentation regarding the regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory. I think we have presenters here and also on video.
Right. Good evening. Can you guys? All right, very
good. Hi, my name is Jody Bechtel. I'm the Assistant Director of the Department, Clark County's Department of Environment and Sustainability. And I'm joined by Marco Vallada with the City of Las Vegas. He's on the phone, and we're here to talk to you about greenhouse gas emissions. So as a quick introduction, if you recall at your last meeting in February, the Nevada Department of Environmental Protection gave a presentation to you about their statewide emissions inventory and discussed state statute and the executive order from the governor that set greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And kind of parallel to that effort that they were doing, that emissions inventory was completed at the end of 2019. The planning directors group from SNRPC had been in discussions about updating our regional emissions inventory that was done in 2014. So obviously it's been several years since that inventory was done, and it is out of date. And the state had mentioned as part of their inventory that it would be helpful to have a more accurate and kind of deep dive into emissions happening at a regional level. And so updating our emissions inventory would be very helpful to the state's efforts as well. So for discussion today, we're going to talk to you about some current GHG emissions data for our region. And Marco Vallada has put together most of the presentation. He'll be talking about the existing data that he's gathered as part of the city's update to their master plan. And then I will talk about some potential path forward and next steps. So I'll turn it over to Marco.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and board members. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. For the record, Marco Vallada, City of Las Vegas. And again, today, I'm going to share a brief overview of our 29 emissions for the board's consideration. This is an update to previous presentations to the board and a high-level assessment of things that have been drafted and carried forward from the city's 2050 master plan as part of the conservation goals that are a part of NRS 278. Just some general takeaways from over the past decade. We know that our energy portfolio has dramatically changed over time as coal has become eliminated from the portfolio. We've known that greenhouse gas emissions mitigation and adaptation efforts have shown some success. And we also know that transportation-based emissions have been can be further reduced through electrification and modal shift. So what this inventory, as it stands now, what it can do is help provide a general sense of the trends that we have seen, but also it shows where some of our limits are. And some chief of them is that there's not a projection that we've developed, but there's opportunities for further collaboration with NDEP and the state emissions inventory. Next slide. So as a part of the overall inventory at a very high level, we used tools available to us through Carbon Disclosure Project using IPCC guidelines and protocols, and we collected some data from the utilities, from NDOT, RTC, NDEP, and US EPA to get a baseline of what our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are for both mobile and stationary sources. Next slide. However, there are some limitations. We can't quantify everything. We're getting some of the very high level information, but we're missing things from specific sources. For example, Boulder City, Overton Power District. Those are not necessarily quantified at a level. We'd have to drill down a little bit more. Same goes for industry. Specific operations from things like mining and manufacturing that have burning involved. There's also emissions from what's called the agricultural, forestry, and other land uses. We don't have anything concrete on those, partly because in the case of agriculture, it's so limited in southern Nevada, and emissions from other land types are relatively small, so to speak, in southern Nevada. The other limit is mobile emissions. There are better ways to quantify emissions from transportation, but right now we're missing some. And then things like off-highway transport, rail, and aviation. We have a general idea of what the energy consumption is and some of the emissions that are coming from those, but it's really premature to really say whether those are accurate or how close they are. Next slide. So with respect to stationary emissions, as I mentioned, our portfolio of energy has gotten a lot cleaner over the past couple of years with the closures of Navajo in Arizona and Reed Gardner in Moapa. Most of NV Energy's owned facilities are natural gas. They do purchase on the open market for some of their power needs, but more or less our grid is a lot cleaner now, and we've seen a corresponding reduction in our overall emissions from NV Energy's generating facilities. Next slide. With respect to electricity, residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, we've consumed about 22.2 billion kilowatt hours of electricity and 1 billion therms of natural gas last year. And those are for all types and all different uses for every single jurisdiction within the region. Next slide. When you convert that into a unit of energy, we use MMBTU. That's a million BTUs. That's a way to factor kilowatt hours in therms and use those to convert to emissions when you apply coefficients. We have about 182 million MMBTUs for stationary sources overall. Next slide. And one of the reasons why our MMBTUs and our stationary sources has gone down is partly through policy. Having the renewable portfolio standard changed during the 2019 session and having the progressive steps over the last decade, year by year, that NV Energy has to comply with has resulted in a cleaner grid. The Public Utilities Commission just got their docket complete for 2019's compliance year, and about 20% of the grid overall in Nevada is from renewables. It's actually about 29 in the Nevada Power Territory and 24% in northern Nevada. Most of that's coming from geothermal and solar, about 40% each. And solar, as the years go by, has taken up a larger share of the pie because of all the development. However, that said, geothermal is non-intermittent and runs 365 days a year. Next slide. So with respect to mobile sources, we know that vehicle miles traveled over the last year has steadily increased year over year. But we don't know what types of fuel or the types of vehicles they're necessarily coming from. We're taking averages and using the functional classifications of roadways to take those estimates. We also don't know things like interstate throughput or freight-based emissions. We do know, though, that fuel economy has been improving, but one of the questions that came up from the end-up presentation is what's going to be the future of transportation? Is improving fuel economy standards going to continue to be sustained? What's going to be the impact of transportation network companies, autonomous vehicles? What's going to happen with renewables and transportation electrification? Next slide. Bottom line, the major issue is modal split. We are still a community that is dominated by single occupant travel. Yes, we had, up until the pandemic, we've had increases in overall transit ridership, and we do have onboard as a future high capacity transit plan that could help mitigate emissions. That's something that, is long term, that is a mitigation strategy that has been successful in other communities as far as shifting the amount of VMT to other modal types. Next slide. The other source of emissions is waste, and we've had a lot of success with keeping waste emissions down since for two factors. One is there's landfill energy that is renewable, that's operational at our region's landfills. We were able to quantify emissions from EPA from both Apex and Sunrise landfill, and overall, because of that, we've been able to keep our emissions down. Our solid waste disposal rate has been changing as well with the recycling center. Our recycling rate has been gradually increasing, not a tremendous amount, but overall, our diversion from the landfills has been progressively getting better over time. Next slide. So when you take a look at regional emissions, and when you take all these factors together and apply coefficients together, you see this gradual decline overall, and we're at about 22.3 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's all the different types of pollutants combined together to give you an equivalent that leads to global warming potential in scientific terms. And you can see the share of how that's broken out. Transportation has gotten larger over time, but we still have a big share that's coming from our built environment, from residential, commercial, industrial. Next slide. When you divide that out from different types of scopes, that's whether they're direct burning or whether it's purchased over the grid through transmission lines, things like that. Most of that, for the region, it's a 50-50 split. But when you take a look at that from a jurisdictional standpoint, we do that for the 2050 master plan, it varies by jurisdiction. So Las Vegas, for example, has a different split in where the emissions are actually coming from and where energy is actually being used. Next slide. And going along with the decrease in emissions, as well as the increase in population that we've seen up to this point, we can see our per capita emissions have been stepping down since we've done a tremendous amount in the community, especially with respect to the renewable portfolio standard. We still have a high rate for a community of our size, but it has been declining over the past 6 years, especially. Next slide. And when you compare that to the state emissions inventory, you can kind of see that same trend. We would have to, again, project out how how different trends and model how different policies and different investments in infrastructure are going to affect our emissions. Next slide. And mitigation strategies vary widely. I mean, there's a wide range of things that we have been doing and that we can continue to do. It's this split between infrastructure, whether it's public, private, or utility. It's policy, it's incentivization, it's doing things like planning and doing specific strategies at the city or county level. All of these things and many more that are not enumerated here can go towards mitigating our overall emissions and improving the environment. Next slide. So the other half of an emissions inventory is also focused on adaptation. What if we still have these impacts from climatic events? As we mitigate our emissions, how do we continue to adapt to specific risks to the Mojave Desert? So looking specifically at resilience, our ability to absorb stresses and maintain our functions as local governments and adapt and organize. How do we improve systems and operations? And that's a function of adaptive capacity and sensitivity, our ability of systems to adapt to changing conditions and the degree in which systems are affected. That gives you vulnerability. And doing a qualitative and quantitative assessment on the next slide. You look at some of the big climatic-oriented hazards that we have. It shouldn't come as a surprise that extreme weather events like monsoonal storms, flash flooding, extreme heat, and drought are our community's biggest vulnerabilities. Next slide. Just briefly on a couple of the details, we've done a lot to adapt. With respect to the drought, a lot of credit has to be given to Southern Nevada Water Authority for the things that they've done. The water infrastructure out at Lake Mead, the construction of the third intake and the low-level pumping station, the strategies for that they employ with conservation, pricing, restrictions, and education. That helps insulate us as a community, because as Lake Mead continues to decline, and it is projected to continue to decline, there will be less acre-feet of water across the entire Colorado River system for municipal and agricultural use. We've done a tremendous job there, and this shows how well we've adapted, but we have to, again, continue to do these types of measures to, especially if we're projected to increase our population. Next slide. Same goes with drought. We've been really proactive since the 1980s to control floods. We still have our usual spots, but we don't have the Charleston underpass flooding anymore. We do have the flooding at the link. Of course, build out of the regional flood control districts network and building out their master plan has really helped reduce the impact of storms and flash flooding. There's going to be a continued risk for more intense storms and with increased frequency and more rapid precipitation. We'll see those during monsoonal seasons, according to a lot of the modeling that goes along with the weather. Next slide. And the last one is extreme heat. There's definitely a higher risk for more intense heat waves with greater temperatures and longer durations. And we do have this nexus with urban heat island effect. We've seen temperatures, even into the 90s, continue to increase over time, both the daytime highs and nighttime lows. They do have an impact on vulnerable communities as well as on infrastructure and service provision. Kind of going back to what Craig was saying at the previous presentation, there's different systems that will definitely be impacted, and there's definitely ways that we can adapt to that through building kit techniques and most definitely through urban forestry. Next slide. It's really tough to say right now what 2020 holds, given the pandemic. We have heard anecdotal evidence that there is a decline in emissions overall and an improvement in environmental conditions. We know that there's been an impact on public transit usage. There's been an impact on vehicle miles traveled. It's going to show itself as we go through another round of modeling a year from now. We do know that with the impacts on the tourism industry, energy consumption and different energy factors are going to shift between sectors. There might be more use in residential, and we might definitely see a drop in commercial, for example. We also know that there's going to be other factors involved. Things like an increase in temperature during the summer might have an impact on the residential sector because the cooling load for residential might go up. And that might look a little bit different from previous years because there's not much commercial activity that's going on. We'll have to see as businesses reopen. Next slide. So with that, I'll hand things back to Jody, and at the end, I'll be available for any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Marco. So as you've heard in the last three presentations, just another thing to consider as we reopen and rebuild is greenhouse gas emissions and, having to address those. So the next steps and possible actions, the Department of Environment and Sustainability is offering to update the 2014 Regional GHG Emissions Inventory, and we can address in that update several of the limitations that Marco noted, adding relevant emissions from additional industries, evaluating carbon sinks and emissions and the impacts of trees, vegetation, urban forestry, agriculture. All of those things were not included in the 2014 report. Some of those things weren't included in the state's emissions inventory as well, so it would really help us get a better understanding of where emissions are coming from in our region. We can add efforts that are being done across the region and all of our communities for mitigation efforts to reduce the GHG emissions. We can obviously establish future projection, mitigation, adaptation goals, milestones, and strategies, which I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then as well, the potential to include reduction benefits for those reduction efforts that can be quantified, and evaluate resilience planning and adaptation strategies, especially for things like extreme heat and the other issues that Marco mentioned. So at this point, when one of our thoughts is this board, being a regional planning coalition, is kind of well suited to perhaps establish some shared goals and metrics that we all may adopt when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So that is also one thing that was not included in the 2014 plan. It didn't set goals or metrics for all of us maybe to aim for. And so that's something that the Department of Environment and Sustainability can work with the Planning Directors Group for SNRPC, and something that this board might consider adopting, and then having each of the member agencies consider to adopt as well. And what that would do is each member entity could continue their own actions, develop their own sustainability and climate action plans, but we would all be using maybe similar methodologies and approaches. And so when we try and combine them to a regional comprehensive perspective, it would be more like comparing apples to apples as opposed to apples and oranges. And it would be easier to understand what's going on at a regional level, roll that up to understand what's happening at the state level, and then as well roll that up to what's happening at a national level as part of the County Climate Coalition, or whatever that may be. We've got a friend in here. So again, the Department of Environment and Sustainability is offering assistance with maybe finding a collective reporting system that if we're all doing our own actions using similar metrics and methodologies, we can all roll that into a similar reporting system that would allow us, again, to have a better understanding of what's going on regionally. So that is the end of the presentation. Like I said, Mark was available for questions. I'm available as well. Marcy Henson, our Director of the Department of Environment and Sustainability, is here as well. And yeah, if you have any questions or discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bechtel and Mr. Vallada, for your presentations on this issue. Commissioner Siegelum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it possible to say how much emissions Henderson puts out, or North Las Vegas, or identifying one of our political entities?
You mean to break it down?
Right. In other words, if we're going to set goals, could we say Henderson does this much this year, and by 2030 we want them to do this much? I mean, because we're all tied together, is it possible to break it down like that?
Right. I do think that there is a challenge there when a lot of the agencies, like what Marco was reporting, Regional Flood Control and Southern Nevada Water Authority, and there's a lot of regional efforts that aren't, necessarily coinciding with our county and city boundaries. But Marco, I don't know if you have input on how the city has approached that and breaking it into particularly the city?
Yes. So thank you, Commissioner. Again, for the record, Marco Vallada. We do have the ability to break it down by jurisdiction. The data sets that I've received from NV Energy and Southwest Gas break each sector down for each jurisdiction. NV Energy also includes Laughlin and a little bit of Nye County. We are able to get that level for stationary combustion. We also can take a look at mobile congestion or mobile emissions the same way, looking at specifically different breakdowns for the transportation network. So our inventory for our 2050 master plan includes the city of Las Vegas itself, as well as our municipal emissions from local government operations.
If I could just follow up with that, and also, is it possible to look at the airport, for example, and just figure out how much they're producing? And then, for example, the school district, how much just their diesel buses must put out a tremendous amount. I think that's part of what we're realizing is that how much pollution we're not seeing because there's no school buses running around.
Right, and I think that's,
Correct.
some of what we could do is, drill down deeper into the specifics of the emissions going on within our own community.
I
Marco, did
believe
you-
the airport already has been going through that process. So I believe we have that information already from the airport.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what we're finding a lot is, a lot of the entities are doing things from a sustainability or climate action plan perspective, and we're not capturing it regionally very well. So I think updating the GHG emissions inventory at a more detailed level is the first step to help us all refine those plans and understand what's going on a larger regional scale.
Any other questions from the committee? Councilwoman Bridges.
Two things. I did want to see if I could get a copy of the slides.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other is what happened with Boulder City. I'm just curious why he mentioned that Boulder City was not included in the data collection. And was that a lack of trying, or was there a reason for that?
No, Marco would probably be best to answer it, but I know that the data he gathered that he presented here was for the City of Las Vegas's master plan update, and it just happened to come in regionally, and then they break down their portion of it. So probably that's why Boulder City wasn't included. If we move forward updating it completely, we would be including Boulder City.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
So Councilwoman, I guess the easy answer to that is NV Energy does not have a service to Boulder City directly. You're getting your power from Hoover Dam. So the good thing there is that a lot of your electric is zero emission anyway. You do, of course, have gas service, so emissions are quantified there. But as far as actual consumption, I mean that's coming from either off the grid itself or for the hydropower.
I think we purchased through Silver State, and
Yes, that's right.
I believe that about 40% of what we get for hydroelectric comes from the dam.
Yeah, and as well, the mesquite isn't included. So there is a lot that wasn't in the data that has been compiled so far. I mean, the city has done a lot of heavy lifting in gathering it, but there is a lot to be done to make it more comprehensive and complete. So
There are other areas of the county that are served by Valley Electric also. I know part of my district is. Okay, any questions from the councilman on the phone?
Yes, Chair Jones, this is Dan Stewart.
Is that Councilman Churchio?
Dan Stewart.
Oh, Stewart, sorry, Councilman Stewart.
Okay, yeah, just from City of Henderson's point of view, I had several questions, but Jody pretty much answered them. I just wanted to say that we are very much in support of this. We want to be able to use whatever resources we can, helping quantify the problem, because you have to quantify the problem before we solve it. So I wanted to put that in there, and appreciate the presentation very much, and looking forward to working together and learning more, participating, quantifying GHG here in our jurisdiction, then rolling that in. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman. Any other questions from those on the phone? If not, then I'm going to go ahead and make a motion that we accept the Clark County Department of Environment and Sustainability's offer to update the regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory and report back to the SNRPC. Any discussion on the motion? Sure, let's second just for fun.
Okay.
All right, all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. I believe the motion passes, right?
I'm sorry, let me do a name
Don't do it.
count first. Commissioner Jones,
Aye.
Councilman Knudsen,
Aye.
Councilman Black,
Aye.
Councilwoman Bridges. Councilman Churchio,
He had to leave the meeting.
okay, thank you.
Okay.
Councilwoman Seaman. Commissioner Siegerbloom? Councilman Stewart?
Yes.
I thought so too.
I think he said he was in
I
favor.
think so too.
Yes. Okay.
You didn't hear me, this Councilman Stewart, yes.
Okay.
So there's 8 yeses and 0 nays.
Thank you. All right. I believe that concludes our agenda. I did want to give the committee the coalition a heads up that because we haven't met for the last 3 months, we do need to adopt a budget. Mario sent me a draft today, and so we'll probably need to meet in the next few weeks to take a look at the budget. And then we also have Mr. Marion, who before COVID-19 was going to come do a workshop with us. And so we're talking about whether we can accomplish that sort of in the same format we are here, where we can still socially distance. And so we'll probably be looking at those 2 items for a upcoming meeting. And with that, we will move to the second time for citizen participation. Is there any public comment?
We have none.
Okay, all right, then our meeting is adjourned. Thank you to our awesome staff for making this all work today.